0400 hours. October 26th, 1942. Deep in the jungle saddle south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige is alone. Around him, 32 Marines from his platoon are dead or incapacitated. In front of him, the spearhead of the Imperial Japanese Army's 29th Infantry Regiment is regrouping for a final bayonet charge. But Paige isn't looking at the enemy. He's staring at the casing of his weapon, the Browning M1917. A one machine gun is a 93-pound beast, designed to fire indefinitely, provided you feed it two things: ammunition and water. Paige has ammunition. What he doesn't have is water. The 7-pint cooling jacket is sizzling. The steam condensing tube, vital for recycling the vapor and hiding his position, is running dry. If that water boils off, the barrel will warp in less than 60 seconds. If the pressure builds without release, the valve will scream like a tea kettle, guiding every Japanese knee mortar in the sector directly onto his head. He is one man, bleeding from a severed nerve in his left hand, holding back a regiment with a weapon that is seconds away from catastrophic mechanical failure. To understand how a single Marine engineers a solution to keep a gun fighting when physics says it should melt, we have to go back to the beginning. The battle for Guadalcanal didn't begin in the jungle. It began in the vacuum of the Pacific Ocean, where the strategic situation for the United States Marine Corps had just collapsed from precarious to catastrophic. Hours before Mitchell Paige faced the darkness, the United States Navy fought the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. It was a tactical disaster. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet, the Doolittle Raider, the queen of the fleet, was burning and sinking. The USS Enterprise was heavily damaged. The Japanese Imperial Navy had effectively swept the board. For the Marines dug into the mud on Guadalcanal, the message was silent but deafening. The Navy was gone. There would be no extraction. There would be no reinforcements. They were orphans, clinging to a tiny perimeter around Henderson Field, the only unsinkable aircraft carrier left in the Solomons. And the Japanese 17th Army knew it. General Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese forces, had identified the fatal weak point in the American line. It wasn't the beaches, and it wasn't the heavily fortified western flank. It was a narrow, jungle-choked corridor of terrain known simply as the Saddle. This depression in the ridgeline, south of the airfield, offered a direct, covered avenue of approach right into the heart of the American position. If the Japanese could punch through here, they would overrun the airstrip, burn the American planes, and sever the lifeline to Australia. To plug this gap, the Marine Corps didn't send a fortress. They sent lieutenants. Colonel Herman Hannikin's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. And at the very tip of Hannikin's spear, guarding the most vulnerable approach, was Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige and his section of heavy machine guns. But the terrain was working against them. The jungle on Guadalcanal isn't just vegetation. It is a sensory deprivation tank. Under the canopy, beneath the torrential tropical rain that began that night, visibility was reduced to zero. You couldn't see the enemy until they were within bayonet range. This environment was the worst possible scenario for Paige's primary weapon system, the Browning M1917A1. To the uninitiated, a machine gun is just a gun that fires fast. But the M1917 was a relic of a different war. Designed by John Moses Browning for the static trenches of World War I, it was a masterpiece of water-cooled engineering, but it was a logistical nightmare for a mobile jungle fight. The weapon system didn't just consist of the gun, it was an anchor. The gun itself weighed 33 pounds. The tripod, a massive steel base needed to absorb the recoil, weighed 53 pounds. The water chest and hoses added another 18 pounds. And the ammunition 250-round cloth belts packed in wooden crates weighed 20 pounds each. A single M1917 unit wasn't a rifleman. It was a 3-man team moving 150 pounds of steel and lead. The gunner fired. The assistant gunner fed the cloth belt to prevent snagging. The ammo carrier ran the logistics, hauling boxes and ensuring the water jacket remained full. This weapon system relied on a specific tactical doctrine: interlocking fields of fire. The logic is geometric. One machine gun firing straight ahead is vulnerable, but two machine guns, positioned 500 yards apart and firing across each other's front, create an X of death, a kill zone where no enemy can survive. This crossfire creates a wall, but like any wall, it only holds if every brick stays in place. If one gun crew dies, the geometry fails. The X breaks, the wall collapses. And Colonel Furemiya, commanding the elite 29th Infantry Regiment, intended to break that wall. Furemiya's men were not the mindless banzai chargers of propaganda. They were veterans. They carried Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives designed to be slid under barbed wire to blow safe lanes for infantry. They moved with a terrifying discipline, crawling through the mud inches at a time, using the sound of the rain to mask their movement. At 0200 hours, the infiltration began. It didn't start with a roar, but with the sudden, violent erasure of the marine perimeter. Grenades flew out of the darkness, landing in the gun pits before the pins even hit the mud. Japanese infiltrators, their skin painted with mud, slipped between the foxholes, cutting communication wires and throat-slitting the runners. Paige's platoon, 33 men strong, began to disintegrate. On the left flank, a grenade landed directly on gun number 1. The explosion killed the gunner and shattered the tripod. The geometry of the defense was instantly compromised. On the right, gun number 4 was overrun. The crew was engaged in hand-to-hand combat before they could even traverse the heavy weapon. The terrifying reality of the M1917 became clear. It was too heavy to swing quickly. If the enemy got inside the minimum range inside the dead space of the gun, the crew was defenseless. Paige ran the line, moving from position to position, trying to re-establish the network. But the attrition was mathematically impossible to sustain. A machine gun needs 3 men to operate efficiently. When the loader dies, the gunner has to struggle with the belt, slowing the rate of fire. When the gunner dies, the ammo carrier has to step up, often with less training on the complex traverse and elevation mechanism. By 0300, the system of the platoon had collapsed. The runners were dead, the flank security was dead, the water carriers were dead. The rain turned the bottom of the foxholes into a slurry of blood and mud. The Japanese 29th Infantry, sensing the collapse, began to stand up. They stopped crawling. They fixed bayonets. They lit flares. The stealth phase was over. The annihilation phase had begun. Mitchell Paige found himself standing in the center of a graveyard. The sophisticated web of mutual support Hanneken had designed was gone. The overlapping fields of fire were gone. All that remained was the darkness, the screaming of the enemy, and the cold realization that the only thing standing between the Japanese army and the helpless airfield was one man who refused to accept that his weapon was obsolete. But if the M1917 was a dinosaur, Mitchell Paige was the one man on Guadalcanal who knew how to make it hunt. To the rest of the Marine Corps, Paige was a platoon sergeant. To the men of Section 2, he was a tyrant of technical perfection. For weeks leading up to this night, Paige had driven his gun crews to the brink of mutiny with a training regimen that bordered on obsession. He didn't care about marching or polishing brass. He cared about the tactile relationship between man and machine in total darkness. He knew that when the attack came, the jungle canopy would blot out the moon. He knew his men wouldn't be able to see the feed tray, the latch, or the charging handle. So he blindfolded them. Day after day, in the sweltering heat of the Solomons, Paige forced his Marines to strip the M1917 down to its pins and springs, clean it, and reassemble it by touch alone. If a Marine dropped a firing pin, they started over. If they fumbled with the cloth belt, they started over. They practiced clearing jams, failure to feed, ruptured cartridge, stuck casing until their fingers bled and their muscle memory was faster than their conscious thought. They hated him for it. They called him a slave driver. But Paige wasn't teaching them to shoot. He was teaching them the physics of the beaten zone. This is the concept that separates a rifleman from a machine gunner. A rifleman aims at a target he can see. A machine gunner aims at the ground he wants to control. Paige understood that in the jungle, you will never see the enemy until it's too late. If you wait for a visual target, you're dead. The solution was to turn the M1917 into a geometric instrument of denial. The M1917 sits on a heavy tripod equipped with a traverse and elevation T and E mechanism. This is a system of screw-threaded dials that lock the gun into a specific horizontal and vertical angle. You don't hold the gun, the tripod holds the gun. You just dial in the coordinates. Paige had spent the days before the attack mapping the terrain of the saddle. He identified the avenues of approach, the gullies and flat patches where the Japanese would have to walk. He then cleared fire lanes, cutting down the tall kunai grass and jungle vines to create clear tunnels of fire. But he went further. He set the guns for grazing fire. In ballistics, a bullet doesn't fly in a straight line. It arcs. Plunging fire is when the bullet goes up and comes down, hitting a specific spot. Grazing fire is far more lethal. It requires the gunner to set the elevation so the cone of fire never rises above the height of a standing man, about 1.8 meters, and never hits the ground for a distance of 600 yards. Effectively, Paige had created an invisible, horizontal sheet of lead hovering at knee height across the entire front of the ridge. He didn't need to see the Japanese soldiers. He just needed to know they were in the lane. Once they entered that geometric box, the cone of fire, the natural dispersion of the bullets caused by the vibration of the barrel, would do the work. It was a mathematical meat grinder. When the Japanese 29th Infantry stood up from the mud and charged at 0315, they weren't running into a gunfight. They were running into a prepared industrial process. Paige, now operating alone amidst his dead crew, didn't panic. He didn't spray the jungle wildly. He grabbed the pistol grip of the remaining functional gun, felt the familiar cold steel of the T and E wheel, and checked the setting. He knew the numbers. He knew that 2 clicks left covered the ravine, and 1 click down grazed the slope. He racked the bolt twice, loading the first round. He pressed the butterfly trigger. The M1917 didn't bark. It chugged. Thump, 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 thump. The rhythm was slow, steady, hypnotic. Out in the darkness, the effect was devastating. The first wave of Japanese attackers simply ceased to exist. They didn't fall, they were erased. The heavy, 30-06 rounds, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, punched through the dense jungle vegetation as if it were paper. Soldiers who thought they were concealed by the night were cut in half by bullets they never heard coming. Paige traversed the gun. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at the flashes of his own tracers, verifying that they were skimming the grass tops exactly as he had calculated. He was playing the instrument. The Japanese officers, confused by the volume of fire coming from a position they thought they had neutralized with grenades, fired flares. The magnesium light drifted down under small parachutes, illuminating a scene of absolute carnage. The beaten zone was a physical reality, a swath of mud churned up by thousands of rounds, layered with the bodies of the 29th Infantry. But the M1917 has a hunger that geometry cannot satisfy. As Paige fired belt after belt, the steam tube began to hiss. The water in the cooling jacket was absorbing the massive heat of the friction, boiling away into the night. And then, the gun jammed. A failure to extract. The spent casing, expanded by the heat, was stuck in the chamber. The next round slammed into the back of it, locking the bolt open. In any other unit, in any other army, this would have been the moment of death. A jammed machine gun in a close-quarters assault is a tombstone, but Paige's mind didn't register panic. It registered drill number 4. His eyes were stinging from sweat and cordite, but his hands knew exactly where to go. He didn't look down. His left hand, the one with the severed nerves, felt for the charging handle. His right hand reached into the receiver, fingers searching for the stuck brass. He was back in the training pit. He was back in the blindfold. He ripped the jam clear, racked the bolt, and resumed firing in less than 4 seconds. The Japanese kept coming. They climbed over their own dead. They realized that the fire was coming from a single point, a single maniacal rhythm in the darkness. They began to focus everything they had: mortars, Nambu light machine guns, grenades on the muzzle flash of Paige's gun. The logic of the beaten zone was holding, but the logic of attrition was catching up. Paige had the skill, and he had the weapon, but he was running out of the one thing that no amount of training could synthesize: the physical capacity to be in 3 places at once. The doctrine of the Marine Corps assumed a squad would protect the gun. There was no squad. There was only Paige, and the jungle was beginning to move around him. The jungle moving around him wasn't a hallucination. It was a tactical envelopment. Standard Marine Corps doctrine in 1942 dictated that a machine gun position was a static fortress. You dug a deep pit, you sandbagged the parapet, and you stayed there until relieved. Leaving the pit was a court-martial offense. Leaving the pit meant abandoning your sector of fire. But as the Japanese 29th Infantry poured through the gaps in the line, Mitchell Paige realized that doctrine was just a suicide pact. The static defense had failed. To his left, the screaming had stopped, which meant the crew of gun number 2 was dead. To his right, gun number 3 had fallen silent 10 minutes ago, its water jacket likely punctured by shrapnel, rendering it a useless lump of iron. The Japanese knew exactly where the American guns were. They had mapped the muzzle flashes and were walking their mortar fire closer with every volley. If Paige stayed in his primary fighting position, he would die. If he retreated, the battalion would die. So, he chose a third option. He decided to become the entire platoon. Paige abandoned the safety of the foxhole. He grabbed his M1917, not by the tripod legs, as regulations required, but by the scalding hot water jacket. He dragged the weapon out of the mud, hauling the 90-pound assembly through the undergrowth to a secondary position 10 yards away. He was violating every rule of machine gun deployment. You do not move a heavy machine gun alone in the dark under fire. It is physically awkward, slow, and leaves you defenseless. But the Japanese mortars pounded his empty foxhole seconds later. The stupid move had saved him. Now, the real nightmare began. A machine gun is a hungry animal. It eats ammunition belts. A standard wooden ammo crate holds two 250-round belts and weighs roughly 22 pounds. Paige had to become his own supply chain. He would fire a belt 30 seconds of continuous grazing fire, then drop the gun, sprint back to the dead crews, scavenge their ammo boxes, and sprint back. The mud on Guadalcanal is legendary. It is a thick, volcanic clay that sucks the boots off your feet. Imagine running sprints in knee-deep glue, blind, carrying a lead weight, while people shoot at you. Paige did this for hours. He began a macabre game of musical chairs. He would drag a gun to a new spot, fire 3 belts, and then move again. He ran from gun 1 to gun 4, clearing jams on weapons covered in the blood of his friends, firing a few bursts to trick the Japanese into thinking the line was fully manned. He was ghosting the ridge. To Colonel Farimius officers down in the valley, it sounded like a dozen Marines were still holding the line. They couldn't conceive that it was one man running a shuttle relay with himself. Then, the war became personal. During one of these desperate ammo runs, a shape detached itself from the shadows. A Japanese soldier, separated from the main assault, lunged out of the elephant grass. He wasn't firing. He was charging with a Type 30 bayonet fixed to his Arisaka rifle. At close range, a rifle is a spear. Paige saw the glint of the 17-inch blade too late to dodge. He threw his left hand up in a reflexive block. The steel bit deep. The bayonet sliced through the webbing of his hand, severing nerves and tendons, carving a trench between his thumb and fingers. The pain was blinding, white-hot and immediate. Paige didn't scream. He reacted with the primal violence of a cornered animal. He drove his own knife into the attacker, ending the fight in seconds. But the damage was catastrophic. He looked at his left hand. It was a ruin. Blood was pumping freely, slicking his sleeve and the receiver of his weapon. In a normal world, this is a ticket home. In the machine gunner's world, it is a mechanical death sentence. The M1917 requires 2 hands to load. The feed pawl mechanism on the top cover is delicate. You have to lay the brass-tabbed end of the cloth belt flat into the feed tray with your left hand while racking the bolt with your right. If the belt is crooked, the gun jams. If the belt is twisted, the gun jams. Paige scrambled back to his gun, his left hand useless, trembling uncontrollably from shock and blood loss. He could hear the Japanese chanting again, gathering for another push. He tried to lift a fresh ammo box. His left hand wouldn't grip. It was dead weight. He had to innovate. He jammed the ammo box against his knee, using his forearm to leverage the lid open. He grabbed the belt with his good right hand, laid it in the tray, and then using the bloody stump of his left hand as a paperweight, held the belt flat while he racked the bolt with his right. Click, clack. He fired. The gun roared. The vibrations sent agony shooting up his arm, but the belt fed. He was operating a crew-served weapon with one hand and a lot of rage. But the physics of the battle were shifting again. The rain had stopped. The air was getting heavy and still, and as Paige fired another long burst into the darkness, he noticed a change in the gun's rhythm. It wasn't the crisp staccato of a well-oiled machine anymore. It was sluggish. He looked at the water jacket. The steam was gone. The hissing had stopped. The water was gone. The jacket was dry. The barrel, now uncooled, was expanding inside the casing. Friction was building exponentially. In less than a minute, the steel would get so hot it would begin to glow cherry red in the dark, acting like a beacon for every sniper in the valley. Worse, the heat would expand the metal until the bullet could no longer pass through, seizing the weapon permanently. He reached for his canteen. Empty. He crawled to the nearest dead Marine, patting down the webbing for a canteen. Empty. The platoon had drunk everything in the sweltering heat before the attack. There was no water. There was no backup. There was only a red-hot gun and a Japanese regiment that had just realized the firing had stopped. The silence of a machine gun on a battlefield is louder than the firing. To the Japanese officers of the 29th Infantry, that silence was a signal flare. It meant the American position was finally dead. It meant the ammunition was gone, the crew was dead, or the weapon had succumbed to the mechanical inevitability of friction. They blew whistles. The chanting rose from a murmur to a roar. They weren't crawling anymore. They were standing up, fixing bayonets, confident that the saddle was open. But Mitchell Paige wasn't dead. He was fighting a war against thermodynamics. The Browning M1917 is a water-cooled system. It relies on a simple physical principle. Water absorbs heat 20 times faster than air. The barrel sits inside a steel sleeve filled with 7 pints of water. As the bullet friction heats the barrel, the water boils, carrying the heat away as steam. It's an elegant cycle, but it has one fatal dependency: the liquid. Without liquid, the temperature inside the barrel spikes to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. The steel expands. The rifling, the spiral grooves that stabilize the bullet begins to melt. The chamber swells, gripping the brass cartridge casing so tightly that the extractor claw rips the rim off instead of pulling the shell out. The gun doesn't just stop, it welds itself shut. Paige could feel the heat radiating off the jacket against his chest. It was like hugging a furnace. He tried to rack the bolt. It was stiff. The metal was already swelling. The tolerance between the moving parts, measured in thousandths of an inch, was vanishing. He needed water. Now. He looked at the empty canteens scattered in the mud. He looked at the rain, which had cruelly stopped, leaving only the humid mist. He looked at the Japanese, now visible as dark shapes surging up the slope, perhaps 40 yards away. He had 10 seconds before they were in grenade range. In the history of warfare, there are moments where dignity and survival become mutually exclusive concepts. This was one of them. Paige didn't hesitate. He stood over the steaming breech of the weapon, fumbled with his buttons with his blood-slicked hand, and urinated directly into the fill port of the water jacket. It wasn't a joke. It was a desperate application of specific heat capacity. Urine is 95% water. To the physics of the gun barrel, it made no difference. The liquid hit the superheated steel inside the jacket. Hiss. A violent cloud of steam erupted from the port, smelling of burnt oil and ozone. But as the liquid boiled, it pulled the heat out of the steel. The expansion subsided. The molecular structure of the barrel stabilized just enough to restore the mechanical clearance. Paige dropped to his knees behind the tripod. He grabbed the pistol grip. His left hand was a useless, bloody claw, so he jammed his forearm against the traversing wheel to lock it. He pulled the trigger. Thump, 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 thump. The gun roared back to life. Down in the valley, the effect was psychological whiplash. The Japanese soldiers, convinced the demon on the ridge was silenced, suddenly found themselves walking back into the meat grinder. The return of the fire was so unexpected, so impossible, that the front rank faltered. They had seen the muzzle flash die. They knew the gun was finished. How was it firing? Paige didn't give them time to solve the riddle. He swept the T and E wheel, traversing the gun violently from left to right. He wasn't firing aimed shots. He was searching and traversing, painting a solid wall of lead across the ravine. But the cost of this performance was being paid in flesh. The gun was running so hot that the heat was transferring through the steel receiver group and into the pistol grip. There were no asbestos mitts left. They had been lost hours ago in the mud. Paige was firing with bare hands. The skin on his right hand, his trigger hand, began to blister. The heavy vibration of the recoil rubbed the raw flesh against the knurled steel of the grip. Every time the bolt slammed home, it sent a shockwave through the burns. He could smell his own skin cooking alongside the gun oil. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He had entered a state of focus that combat psychologists call tachypsychia, the distortion of time. The screaming of the Japanese, the thud of the bolt, The searing pain in his hands, it all faded into a dull background noise. The only thing that existed was the belt. The cloth belt fed into the receiver. The brass gleamed in the moonlight. The links stripped. The casings ejected. Feed, fire, eject, feed, fire, eject. He was a machine servicing a machine. The Japanese, realizing that a frontal assault against this undead gun was suicide, shifted tactics. They stopped charging and started crawling again, moving to the flanks, trying to find the edge of his traverse. They could see the steam now, a white plume rising from Paige's position, illuminated by the tracers. It made him a target, but it also made him a monster. To the superstitious conscripts of the 29th Infantry, the American position seemed possessed. Paige sensed the flanking move. He unlocked the elevation screw, dropping the nose of the gun to point almost directly into the dirt in front of him. He fired into the ground, skipping rounds off the hard-packed coral beneath the mud. The bullets ricocheted, tumbling unpredictably through the grass at ankle height. Screams erupted from the darkness to his left. The ricochets were finding the crawlers. He had held the line for 4 hours. He was dehydrated, bleeding from a bayonet wound. His hands were third-degree burns, and his weapon was cooled by his own waste. But the line held. The pile of empty ammo crates around him grew into a rampart. Then, the dawn began to crack the sky over the Pacific. The gray light filtered through the jungle canopy, revealing the scale of the slaughter. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in the fire lanes. But the light also revealed Paige. He was no longer a hidden muzzle flash in the dark. He was a lone figure, exposed, surrounded by dead Marines and empty boxes. The Japanese officers saw him. They saw that it wasn't a company or a platoon. It was one man. And they realized that if they rushed him now, all at once, from every angle, the mathematics of reload speed would finally kill him. A machine gun can only shoot in one direction at a time. They rose up from the grass, hundreds of them, fixing bayonets for the final time. They weren't yelling. They were moving with the grim determination of men who knew the game was up. Paige pulled the trigger. Click. The belt was empty. He reached for the next box. It was empty. He looked around the pit. The last crate was gone. The miracle had bought him time, but it hadn't bought him ammo. The gun was hot, wet, and silent. And this time, there was no fluid in the world that could make it fire without bullets. Mitchell Paige stood up. He looked at the wave of tan uniforms rushing up the slope. He looked at his ruined hands. And then, something snapped in the logic of the battlefield. He didn't reach for his sidearm. He didn't turn to run. He looked at the M1917A1 Springfield rifle lying in the mud next to a dead private. It had a bayonet fixed to the end. The defender was done. The defender was done, but the predator was just waking up. Mitchell Paige realized that the physics of the battle had inverted. For hours, the equation had been simple. The Japanese had the momentum, and he had the position. But now, with the machine gun silent and the sun cresting the horizon, the Japanese were hesitating. They were exhausted, traumatized by the invisible wall that had eaten their regiment, and waiting for orders. In the psychology of close-quarters combat, hesitation is a vacuum. If you don't fill it with violence, the enemy will fill it with yours. Paige didn't wait for the inevitable overwhelming rush. He didn't wait to be overrun. He kicked over the pile of empty ammunition crates that had served as his rampart and stepped out into the open gray light. He held the scavenged M1917A1 Springfield rifle across his chest. The 16-inch steel bayonet, fixed to the end, caught the dawn's light. He looked back at the few surviving stragglers of his platoon riflemen, a couple of wounded ammo carriers, men who were dazed, deafened, and preparing to die. "Fix bayonets," Paige croaked. His voice was a ruined gravel, shredded by smoke and screaming. "We're going down." It was a command that defied sanity. You do not charge down a hill into a superior force. You do not leave the high ground. But Paige understood something the Japanese officers didn't. The enemy was fragile. They had spent 6 hours walking into a meat grinder. They were terrified. If the demon of the ridge suddenly came at them, it wouldn't be a tactical maneuver. It would be a psychological break. Paige screamed a sound that was less a battle cry and more a release of pure, distilled hatred, and sprinted down the slope. The few remaining Marines, seeing their blood-soaked sergeant charge alone, didn't think. They followed. It was a chemical reaction. They rose from the mud like the undead and chased him into the fog. For the Japanese soldiers of the 29th Infantry, The sight was paralyzing. They were preparing to assault a fortified machine gun position. Instead, they saw a man covered in dried blood and gun oil, his hands wrapped in rags, charging them. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. The script of the battle had been violated. The front rank of the Japanese force didn't fire. They flinched. Paige hit the line at a dead run. The M1917A1 Springfield is a heavy, balanced weapon, designed in an era when the rifle was still considered a pike. Paige drove the bayonet into the first soldier with the momentum of a freight train. He didn't stop to fence. He relied on the shock action of the charge. The violence was intimate and chaotic. The machine gun war of geometry and angles was replaced by the wet thud of rifle butts and the flash of steel. The Marines, fueled by the hysteria of survival, fought with a savagery that stunned the exhausted Japanese. The Japanese line, which had held together through hours of artillery and machine gun fire, suddenly shattered. It wasn't a tactical retreat, it was a panic. The fear contagion spread from the front rank to the rear. Officers shouted orders that were ignored. The belief in victory evaporated, replaced by the primal need to get away from the madman on the ridge. The Japanese assault force broke. They turned and fled back into the jungle, leaving their dead and their equipment behind. Paige chased them until his lungs burned and his legs finally refused to obey his brain. He collapsed in the tall kunai grass, gasping for air, the rifle slipping from his ruined hands. The ridge was silent. The rain had stopped. The screaming had stopped. Minutes later, the brush behind the American line crashed open. It wasn't the enemy, it was the reserve force. Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hannikin, the battalion commander of the 2/7ths, burst into the clearing, leading a company of fresh Marines. Hannikin was a legend in his own right, a man who had killed Charlemagne Peralta in Haiti years before, but what he saw on the ridge stopped him cold. He had come expecting to find a breach. He had come expecting to find the Japanese pouring through the saddle toward the airfield. He had expected to fight a desperate rearguard action to save the battalion. Instead, he found a graveyard of the Imperial Japanese Army. The slope was carpeted with bodies. The fire lanes Paige had cut were choked with the dead, piled in the grotesque geometry of the beaten zone. There were hundreds of them. And in the center of it all sat Mitchell Paige, alone, surrounded by a mountain of spent brass casings that came up to his shins. Hannikin walked through the carnage, his boots crunching on the empty shells. He approached Paige. The sergeant was barely recognizable. His uniform was black, with blood and carbon. His hands were blistered masses of raw flesh. He looked like a man who had walked out of a blast furnace. Hannikin knelt beside him. He didn't ask for a situation report. He didn't ask about the position. He looked at the steam still rising from the water jacket of the M1917. Then at the bodies, then at Paige. "Sergeant," Hannikin said quietly, "how many did you get?" Paige looked up, his eyes glassy, focused on something 1,000 yards away. "I don't know, sir," he whispered. "I was too busy shooting." The reinforcements moved past them, securing the perimeter, checking the bodies. They walked with a hushed reverence, glancing at the lone machine gun and the man sitting beside it. They saw the empty water cans. They saw the urine stains on the gun. They saw the blood on the feed tray. They began to piece together the physics of what had happened. This wasn't just a defense. It was a masterclass in lethality. The threat to Henderson Field was over. The Japanese 29th Infantry hadn't just been defeated. They had been eviscerated. The regiment was combat ineffective. The saddle was secure. The airfield and the lifeline to Australia remained in American hands. But as the adrenaline faded, the reality of the cost began to set in. Paige looked around for his platoon. He looked for the men he had trained to strip the gun blindfolded. He looked for the boys he had screamed at in the mud for dropping firing pins. He saw bodies, 32 of them. The victory wasn't a triumph. It was a transaction. He had traded everything, his men, his body, his soul, to keep a piece of geometry closed to the enemy. He had proven that one man with a machine gun could stop a regiment, but he had also learned the terrible isolation of being the anomaly. The Medal of Honor would come later. The parades would come later. But in that moment, sitting in the mud of Guadalcanal, Mitchell Paige wasn't a hero. He was just the last moving part in a broken machine, surrounded by the silence he had created. That silence followed Mitchell Paige for the rest of his life. When the adrenaline finally crashed and the medical corpsman peeled the shredded uniform off his body, the full accounting of the night began. The numbers were stark, cold, and horrifying. Of the 33 Marines in his machine gun platoon, the men he had drilled, blindfolded, and bullied into perfection, 32 were casualties. Paige was the only one left standing. The battalion intelligence officers later walked the ground in front of his position to conduct a bomb damage assessment. They weren't looking for heroism. They were looking for tactical data. What they found confirmed the terrifying efficiency of the Grazing Fire doctrine. They counted between 110 and 140 Japanese bodies stacked directly in the fire lanes of Paige's guns. They weren't scattered randomly. They were piled in the geometric cones of fire that Paige had engineered. He hadn't just survived, he had solved a mathematical equation of death. 5 months later, in Balboa Park, San Diego, General Alexander Vandegrift, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, fastened the Medal of Honor around Mitchell Paige's neck. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and utter disregard for personal safety. The press called him a one-man army. But to Paige, the star-shaped piece of bronze hanging around his neck didn't feel like an award. It felt like an anchor. It weighed exactly as much as 32 dead Marines. For decades after the war, Paige refused to talk about the glory of Guadalcanal. He lived a quiet life. Hasbro even made a G.I. Joe action figure in his likeness, the Marine machine gunner. But while the public saw the toy soldier, Paige was fighting a new, private war that would consume his final years. He became a hunter. But this time, he wasn't hunting Japanese infantry. He was hunting liars. In the years following Vietnam and the Gulf War, a disturbing trend emerged in America: stolen valor. Men who had never served, or who had served in safe rear echelon jobs, began appearing at parades and VFW halls wearing medals of honor they had bought at flea markets or forged in basements. They craved the respect that came with the blue ribbon. They wanted the free drinks, the handshakes, the awe in people's eyes. Most veterans ignored them as pathetic. Mitchell Paige did not. To Paige, a fake Medal of Honor wasn't a harmless lie. It was a theft. When a man pinned that medal to his chest without earning it, he wasn't just lying about his own life. He was stealing the deaths of the men in the mud of the saddle. He was stealing the final moments of the ammo carrier who died running a box to gun number 3. He was stealing the agony of the loader who bled out in the rain so the gun could keep firing. Paige treated these frauds with the same Grazing Fire intensity he had applied to the 29th Infantry. He worked directly with the FBI and the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. He became a forensic expert on his own award. He chased down leads on imposters across the country. If someone claimed to be a recipient, Paige would pull the archives. He would check the citations. He would verify the unit rosters. He wasn't doing it for the sanctity of the medal. He was doing it because he knew the cost of the real one. The burden of the medal is that it is not a prize for winning. It is a receipt for suffering. It signifies that you were present at a moment when humanity collapsed, and you were forced to do the impossible to survive. It is a symbol of the worst night of your life. Paige understood that the Medal of Honor doesn't belong to the living recipient. It belongs to the ghosts who made the recipient's survival possible. He was merely the custodian. He was the vault keeper. When he confronted these imposters, he didn't scream. He simply exposed them with the cold, hard facts of the record. He stripped them of their stolen glory just as efficiently as he had stripped the jams from his M1917. He ensured that federal laws were passed to criminalize the wearing of unearned decorations. He made it dangerous to lie about courage. This was his true post-war legacy. He didn't rest on his laurels. He spent 50 years guarding the perimeter of the Medal of Honor, ensuring that no one could infiltrate that sacred ground unless they had paid the admission price in blood. Mitchell Paige died in 2003, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the Guadalcanal campaign. But he died knowing that the integrity of the award remained intact. He had held the ridge in 1942, and he had held the truth for 60 years after that. The M1917 was long gone, rusted into history. The jungle had reclaimed the saddle, but the lesson remained. Technology and training can win a battle, but only character can sustain the victory. Paige proved that a single man, armed with the right machine and the right will, is a strategic asset. But he also proved that the deadliest weapon on the battlefield isn't the gun. It's the man who refuses to quit, whether the enemy is a regiment of soldiers or a lie that threatens to erase history. Mitchell Paige proved that the deadliest weapon on the battlefield isn't the one with the highest caliber. It's the one that is fully integrated with the operator. The story of the saddle on Guadalcanal is often retold as a miracle. It is framed as a supernatural event where one man held back a tide, but to view it as a miracle is to disrespect the professionalism of the Marine NCO. What happened on the 26th of October 1942 wasn't magic. It was physics. It was the triumph of Grazing Fire over the Banzai charge. It was the result of thousands of hours of blindfolded drills, burnt fingers, and the obsessive, tyrannical refusal to accept mechanical failure. Paige didn't just fight hard. He engineered a kill zone. He understood that the M1917 wasn't just a gun. It was a machine that converted logistics, water, ammunition, and will into area denial. When the logistics failed, he substituted his own body fluids. When the crew failed, he substituted his own movement. He became the servo mechanism for the gun, keeping the geometry of the defense intact even when the human component had been reduced to one. This is the geometry of courage. It is the understanding that in the chaos of war, there are invisible lines drawn in the dirt angles of fire, sectors of observation, supply thresholds. If you hold these lines, you survive. If you abandon them, you die. Mitchell Paige held the line not because he was fearless, but because he knew exactly what would happen if the geometry broke. He saved Henderson Field because he refused to let the math of the battlefield defeat him. But Mitchell Paige wasn't the only American innovator fighting a lonely war against doctrine in the Pacific. While Paige was proving that a machine gun could hold a ridge against a regiment, thousands of miles away, the U.S. Army Air Forces were facing their own impossible problem. The Japanese Navy was reinforcing their island garrisons with convoys that American high-altitude bombers couldn't hit. The B-17 seconds were dropping bombs from 20,000 feet, and the Japanese ships were simply turning out of the way. The hit rate was less than 1%. The doctrine was failing. The Pacific was being lost because the Americans couldn't sink a moving ship. They needed a new geometry. They needed a man who looked at a B-25 bomber and didn't see a high-altitude precision instrument. He saw a heavy shotgun that belonged on the deck. They needed Major Paul Pappy gun. Next time, we are going to leave the mud of Guadalcanal and climb into the cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell over the Bismarck Sea. We will tell the story of how one mad scientist mechanic hacked the nose off a bomber, filled it with stolen .50 caliber machine guns, and invented a tactic that defied the laws of aerodynamics: skip bombing. We will show you how Pappy gun taught 10,000-pound bombers to skip explosives across the water like stones, smashing the Japanese Navy in a single morning. The Japanese called it the massacre. We call it the birth of the gunship. If you want to understand the mechanical evolution of victory, you need to be here for that story. So, do your duty. Click that subscribe button and ring the bell. The algorithm buries these stories because they are complex, violent, and real. By liking this video, you are forcing the system to recognize that history matters. You are helping us rescue these narratives from the archives. Leave a comment below. What is the single greatest feat of individual endurance you've ever read about? Was it Paige, Basilone, or someone we haven't covered yet? Let us know. I'm your military history architect. Well, see you in the Bismarck Sea. Dismissed.